System Shock, the 2023 remake of the Looking Glass original, has finally arrived on consoles, and I think you should play it, or at least give it a shot. Taking a top spot on my personal Game of the Year list last year, this re-envisioning of Shock stands as one of the most engaging immersive sims I've ever played. This is a game that does not hold your hand. There are no waypoints here. It asks a lot of the players, but it gives a lot in turn. And now, owners of PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series consoles can also enjoy it. Thus, today I wanted to give you an idea of how System Shock fares in the console space. How does it run on the various platforms? Does it retain everything that made the original release good on PC? How are the controls? Let's find out. As I covered in my original video, the 1994 release of System Shock is one of the earlier examples of a true immersive sim as we know it today. A systems-driven game designed to offer players a series of problems to solve via a growing set of tools. The freedom on offer enabled a level of interactivity and player agency that was, for the time, revolutionary, and still relatively uncommon today. The 2023 remake, however, retains this freedom while greatly improving upon the core mechanics. The shooting, movement, encounters, and general feel of play are all fantastic. But of course, this original version was clearly designed for mouse and keyboard play. It is a complicated game after all, with a vast interface to explore. The initial PC release did launch with quote-unquote partial controller support. That is, gamepads did function, but certain features were not fully implemented and support was clearly unfinished. Now that it's on consoles, however, the controller becomes the primary way that most users will experience the game. So how does it fare? Well, I'll start by saying this: while I ultimately prefer mouse and keyboard, controller support is now a lot better, and it's very playable without sacrificing the game's inherent complexity. The controls are fully remappable as you like, and things like inventory management and other cursor-driven actions manage to work reasonably well with the analog stick driving the cursor around. There are still some actions that require a little more fiddling when using a gamepad, but by and large, it plays very well this way. However, as has become standard for Nightdive releases, System Shock supports mouse and keyboard on consoles as well, so if you prefer to play it like the PC original, the option exists. You just connect your keyboard and mouse to the system, and it will seamlessly work even mid-game. This flexibility also extends to the number of platforms supported. You see, System Shock is available for every PlayStation and Xbox console released since 2013. When playing on Xbox Series X or the PlayStation 5, System Shock runs at 60 frames per second with a native 4K resolution target. Dynamic resolution scaling is in effect, of course, so it does vary depending on the situation, but by and large it retains the visual niceties of the original game and image quality is excellent. With so many versions to test, I wasn't able to play through the game on every machine, mind you, but based on what I have experienced, it delivers a solid 60 frames per second on both machines, with only an occasional, rather rare hiccup in certain circumstances. Otherwise, whether you're on PS5 or Xbox Series X, you can expect basically a perfect 60 frames per second. It's a very smooth, fluid game. I really have zero complaints here in terms of the overall performance profile. Perhaps more impressively, the Xbox Series S version is similar, with max resolution dropping to 1800p instead, while still targeting 60 frames per second. DRS is a little more active in this version, but I still think it's one of the better Series S conversions I've seen lately. It's really solid on this system, and a good way to play the game. Curiously, on PlayStation 5, if your display supports 120Hz, the game will launch within a 120Hz container. However, the game itself is still capped at 60 frames per second, so it's only really potentially useful for VRR. Yet it's so stable that VRR isn't really necessary either, so it's kind of an interesting quirk. Perhaps they're leaving the door open for a PS5 Pro patch? Obviously, the Xbox version can also output 120Hz, but this is determined by the OS, not the game. Yet it also reveals one minor issue I encountered. So if you start the game on a 120Hz display, then disconnect the console and move to a 60Hz display, as I do for capture, and you use quick resume, There's a chance that the game will start at 30 frames per second like this. I'm playing on the Series S here, and as you can see, it is just 30 FPS. So what's going on? My guess is that they're using a half refresh rate VSync option to cap the game at 60 FPS within that 120Hz container. But when you drop the OS to 60Hz without closing the game, with quick resume enabled of course, this half rate setting perhaps remains in effect, resulting in half of 60Hz as opposed to half of 120, which means 30 FPS. Simply close and reboot the game and you'll be fine though, and this isn't a scenario I expect most players will deal with. I simply move consoles around often due to the need to capture them for work. You may also have noticed these tiny little blips here on the frame time graph, which is something we don't really see on the other consoles. Well, PS5 and Xbox Series X anyways. The fluctuations seem very minor, but they are there, so it's worth mentioning. Now, the last gen versions are interesting because you can expect 1080p with dynamic resolution on both PS4 consoles, but the frame rate is limited to 30 frames per second. This is also true of every Xbox One console. Though Xbox One S is 1080p dynamic, the original Xbox One maxes out at 966p, and then Xbox One X pushes it all the way up to 4K with DRS again, but it is still capped at 30 FPS. From what I understand, the last gen version is limited by the CPU, thus the 30 FPS cap is necessary. One other note on the last gen versions of the game: while loading times are acceptable, they are certainly longer than on modern SSD equipped machines, and as such, you'll be waiting more on death and when moving between floors. Loading times are average for Unreal Engine 4 games on these machines, but when you're used to SSD loading times, going back to the older machines can be somewhat challenging. Really though, the visuals are excellent across the board and fully retain the visual language and designs of the original PC version without issue, even on an original Xbox One. As far as Unreal Engine 4 games ported to console are concerned, the results here are quite good, and especially impressive considering the console porting team consists of just 4 people. Yeah, that's pretty impressive, right? As a quick aside though, System Shock also serves as a nice demonstration of why I enjoy the use of per pixel motion blur, which by the way is an optional setting in this game. So look at the pipe as I swing it here. With motion blur engaged, the animation is accentuated and enhanced by the use of per pixel motion blur. If we disable the blur however, you'll notice that it looks more framey and less fluid to the eye. Can you spot the difference? The thing is though, is that I get it. The primary issue people have with motion blur is focused on camera blur, when the whole scene blurs as you rotate the camera and look around. But when it comes to animation and objects, I feel that it has such a positive impact on the presentation, even at high frame rates, that it's a must-use feature in many games. But hey, like I said, if you don't like it, it's optional. Beyond motion blur, you can also adjust the FOV, and not just one slider either. They actually split this out between the normal gameplay and the cyberspace sections, which plays more like a 6 degrees of freedom shooter. As far as console games go then, the options menu is robust. Now another benefit of playing on console stems from support for surround sound. Not that the PC version also isn't capable of this, it's just that people are more likely to use a console with a surround sound system, which just happens to be true in my case. As a result, it's the first time I really played the game seriously in surround sound, and I felt that it makes a huge difference in terms of audio immersion. System Shock already sounds fantastic with a great score and lots of atmospheric sound effects and voices throughout, but expanding this out into a surround soundscape increases that immersion factor significantly. Even if you're playing in stereo though, it really does sound awesome.
Searching.
So the key here is that System Shock on console is just about the best conversion one could have hoped for. As this is such a PC-focused experience built primarily for mouse and keyboard, I did have concerns going into it, especially with the incomplete gamepad support at release. But those concerns are unfounded. Everything I loved about the original release is intact, and it plays great even if you're using a controller, which, by the way, the PC version was also updated with improved controller support as well. If I may put my gaming hat back on then, my feelings on System Shock really haven't changed. If anything, I've come to appreciate it even more. It's technically a remake, sure, but it feels like a new game that was just inspired by the 1994 original. It's a game that truly respects the player, I feel. As I mentioned, System Shock does not hold your hand. You'll need to genuinely pay attention to your actions, read logs, and take note of all the information you pick up along the way. It never explicitly spells out what you need to do or where to go next. It's all handled organically, requiring you to actually pay attention. System Shock puts its trust in the player, and it's something I greatly appreciate. Really, that feeling of making your way through a new area for the first time, low on ammunition and health, carefully rummaging through containers and offices in search of clues and health, using every tool in your inventory to bypass difficult foes. It's amazing. The tension is palpable. So yeah, if you couldn't tell, I love System Shock, and I think you should give it a shot, if you enjoy this sort of shooter, of course. And thankfully, however you choose to play it, every version of the game is perfectly solid. Thus, it receives a full recommendation from us here at Digital Foundry. Go and play some System Shock.